Okay. Let me just spotlight and spotlight. Okay, welcome back to the second International Colloquium on the Metaphysics and Semantics of Fiction. This is the afternoon session. Today is the last day of the colloquium. It's Friday. And this afternoon, we will have the talks by Felipe Zárate Guerrero, Italo Lemos, and Elisa Paganini. And this is Felipe Zárate Guerrero from Durham, UK, and he will present about truth in fiction, explicitism, and canon in comics. Felipe, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. So let me share my screen. Here we have. Okay, so truth in fiction, explicitism, canon in comics. I'm going to talk about the first part of my research that I'm doing right now, which is based mostly in the way in which David Lewis understood truth in fiction, and my intention here is to show why comics are a very interesting case of study to understand and to readdress traditional issues that we philosophers have when we talk about intentions and interpretation in a very general way. So let me start with some concerns that comics have. So we have three statements. The first one, Superman isn't faster than the Flash. The second one, Superman Prime undoubtedly surpasses the first Flash, Jay Garrick. And statement number three, both statements 1 and 2 hold true within the comic book universe. So here we have something very interesting, and is the way in which we understand some characters inside comics. And this is something that is interesting because I'm going to talk about later. It addresses something that is the canon that comic readers, they are very familiar with. That is like a vertebral column of things that we as readers understand that they are true in the in the comic universes, and that they help us to understand this type of statements. So there is no contradiction. There is no contradiction for a reader that knows specifically what the Superman Prime is, what the Jay Garrick is. There is no contradiction to say that Superman isn't faster than the Flash, but then to say that there is a Superman that is faster than a Flash. So this is a broad concern, but I'm going to address this with the idea of canon, as I just anticipated, and that is something that I want to explore during also my broader research. So first, the main purpose of this is that I'm going to understand the way in which we're going to talk about comics within something that is called the massive serialized collaborative fiction. There is a concept that was developed by Thomas Cook a couple of years ago, and that it not only encompasses comics in there, he is also interested in broader things such as video games, serials, movies, all those fictions that are massive. I'm going to explain what is that later, but that they are not singular. And that's the main difference with the way in which we normally try to address this issue in philosophy of literature. That is that we have, the traditional view is that we have one author, and the author is writing one, in this case, one fiction, and then the same author is writing new fictions that are in the same universe. So the main example is Sherlock Holmes. So we have Arthur Conan Doyle, one author, and when we want to understand what is happening with the fiction that Arthur Conan Doyle is doing, so we just need to read like a bunch of texts that are like at the core of the Sherlock Holmes stories, no? That is something that we cannot do with comics, because in comics we have not only different authors, but also different, I will talk about that later, but different producers, no? So we have the inker, we have also the company that holds the copyrights of some characters. So there are many intentions that are going on around the production of comics. That is also true for movies. We have the director, but also the producer, but also the one that is working with backstage. So, but we're going to narrow it down for comics. So with this in mind, let's remind also the three sources of truth for David Lewis. So in his very famous text, he addresses three ways in which we can find source of truth in fiction. The first one is explicit content, which is the way in which we normally try to look for truth in statements. So something that is specific to a fiction, and the way in which he addresses it is adding the in fiction F. So we have like a location that makes that statement true. The second one is the backgrounds and the beliefs that the not only the author but also the community that was addressing the fiction they share. So this is going to be very important for understanding what canon is, because what I'm going to talk later is that the way in which canon is officialized is by doing some negotiations between that community of people that reads and also the community of people that is doing the comic. And then the third and most important in the case of comics, the third source of fiction, that is the carryover from one fiction to another. So we have intrafictional truths and interfictional, that is truths that are shared within the same storyline of comics, but also between different comics, no? Of course, Lewis is not talking about comics, so I'm just going to take this framework to understand this case of study. So before that, I anticipated this a little bit. What is interpretation? So we have two major, very big perspectives of it. The first one is the intentionalism, that says that the object of interpretation is meaning, and we should found that meaning in the author intention. And the second one is, I will call them explicitism. Sometimes you can find them this also as anti-intentionalist perspectives. That is quite the opposite. Meaning is to find in the intrinsic language of the literary text, not necessarily in the author intentions, because sometimes what is written there can be different from what the author intended to do. And again, another anticipation. I think that one of the best ways to read comics is within the explicitism perspective, and I'm going to try to explain why. This is my stand. Before that, we have two ways of understanding intentionalism. So the actual, that is also called maybe the extreme posture of intentionalism, and the hypothetical one, that is the more mild. The actual is said that you need to understand intentions, like real intentions with like specific things that will guide you to prove that those are the intentions. So you need to discern that from, in this case, texts or other ways of communicate intentions that the author might have. And nowadays we have also, for example, social media, interviews, YouTube videos, in which you can find statements of the author talking about the same, his or her own work. So actual intentionalism, they will look for those intentions to understand a text. So things that are outside, that can be outside of the text itself, to understand what is written there. And that is the extreme position. And then we have the mild position, that is the hypothetical one, that said we don't need to actually find what the author wants, but we need to conjecture the author. So we need to create this fictional author, like kind of a fictional entity who speaks to us, to the audience, to the readers, and we in that way we can make sense of a text just by creating this fictional author to speak with us. So this will be very tempting to understand fiction, because you can have multiple authors, as the case of comics, but you actually don't need to understand all the intentions of those authors, because you are creating one fictional author that can gather all those intentions together, which is different from the actual intentionalism, because in there is very difficult to see how can you read a comic if you have all those intentions that may collapse maybe sometimes to each other. So what happens with non-classic fictional text, which is the massive serialized collaborative fiction? So I'm just going to explain this a little bit more. By massive, we're talking about things that are almost impossible for us to read, because there's like just a huge, vast amount of text that have been written within that fiction. That is the case of comics. So this is like an impossibility, epistemological impossibility more than metaphysical one. This talks about the thing that we cannot do as readers. So maybe we can try to look for what Superman, comics of Superman, but there are like hundreds of them. So we will spend like years if we want to read them all. So that's a massive. Then we have serialized. So this is very important, because this will link the third source of fiction, that is like truth is going to be preserved during different comics or specific texts, and collaborative. That means that there is not one author, but like we have a bunch of them that are trying to have one product. Okay, so with comics we have something that is very problematic, that is the retroactive continuity, or retcon for short, which is a literary device that basically can change something from the past by adding something in the future compared to that past. So the classic example is Sherlock Holmes' death. So Conan Doyle said that Sherlock Holmes died in these waterfalls, but then he needed to change that because all the fans were we don't want him to be dead. So this is something that can be used in normal text, but in comics it's extreme. It happens all the time. We have different eras in comics. So I have here just one small example of it. The origin of Wonder Woman. So at the beginning, it looked like she was made out of clay, but then in 2012, Hippolyta, that is the mother, she said, no, actually, you are the son of Zeus, you are the daughter of Zeus, you were not born out of clay. So this changed the origin of Wonder Woman, but then we have in 2023, again, something that might say that she was again born of clay and she's not the daughter of Zeus. So this is something problematic, because it is always changing the interpretation that we have of one comic. So at the end, do we know what's the origin of Wonder Woman? How can we know that? So I'm just going to, I have some other examples here. I'm just going to go to the solution. And okay, before that, so the retcon problem raises question about how does a text attain authority? How do we know that we need to believe the one that was published in 2023 instead of 2012? What tools do we have as readers to identify this as a proper text? What mechanism facilitate its inclusion to the accepted corpus, that is to the comic, and who determines the status of authoritative? So yes, those are the challenges. My suggestion is that we have something that is called the Statale stories, that is stories that are connected to each other. This is also a Lewis word. And within this idea of satellite stories, we have something that are canonical relative, so something that holds the true that we as readers need to do, and also the authors need to check before they do their comics or their fictions, to find something that is true, that should be hold during the whole story. So in the case of, for example, Star Wars, we have truth that is in movies at the beginning, but also in comics, and also in video games, and also in series. So this led us to the idea that there is something that is hierarchical in canon. So there are some things that holds more true or more legitimate than other things. And this is very interesting because it also means that truth in fiction, especially in canon, in comics, is something that is fluid, that is not stable, or like it should be preserved every time. And it also will change from author to author. So in the case of massive serial fiction that combine different things, because comics, they are not by their own now, they have also intramedia connections. This is a way in which you can identify which text holds the most important truth. No. Another factor that is very interesting here is the idea of collaboration and negotiation. So there's always debates among what is the truth. For example, in the case of comics, again, what is the origin of Wonder Woman? So if you ask to someone, that person will say, I'm going to take the 2023 as the more canonical text, and someone will say, no, that is not canonical. The canonical one is the 2012, and then they will have to argue. The thing is that how can we discern between which is right or which is wrong? So what's the correct interpretation in this case? And my suggestion is that we need to look for the coherence criteria. That is something that will make, will explain the most with the less effort. And this is the thing that I'm working on right now. How can we establish that coherence criteria? So this is an example from the Fantastic Four. So this is the Invisible Woman, and it looks like she is not in this image. She is not the real Invisible Woman. She is a alien from another world that is portraying as the Invisible Woman. So it is incoherent here for her to touch the gem and become invisible, because she doesn't have that power, because she is fake. She is not the real Invisible Woman. So, for example, here, how can we understand this? What happened here? Is it incoherent? So Marvel, they wrote and they have like something that is very interesting, that is the known price, and in which they ask to the people, to the audience, to the comic book readers, make sense of this. How can you make sense of this? So they gave them a price that is a known price, and people, they just gave their solutions. And so to identify which one was the correct one, so we have something that is the coherence criteria. But this is the thing that I need to work on right now. But that's the way towards I want to throw my response within fiction. So I think we have just 1 minute, and then 10 more minutes. Can you help me with the time again?
Oh, so it's 2 more minutes until 20 minutes have elapsed. Yes.
Okay. Yes, thank you. So yes, for me, the coherence criteria is the way in which we can solve the question of which text should hold the most authoritative or legitimate to address what is true or not in comics. And in here, we need to distinguish between what is logically possible with what is plausible. So there are many things that can be possible in fiction, and like in real life also, but that is not exactly something that should be plausible, because plausibility means that there must be a coherent sense that ties all the truth together, no? So, for example, here it is possible that it was not possible that the gem disappeared, but it is plausible that it was carried away by a minute-sized scroll. That is the alien that was portraying the invisible woman here. So in this case, we have an example of the way in which coherent criteria will solve a problem that was incoherent at the very beginning, no? So maybe this can become canon, is the idea that school has miniaturized in that sample. So this gave us with some ideas, just to wrap up, and is that it seems that in the creation and reception of comics, intentions are important, but the most important thing here is the what we consider as canonical, what are the bunch of texts that hold the truth to understand and to interpret a comic. And to understand that, we need to go again and understand the way in which those negotiations between readers, authors, and creators in general are making sense of the stories that they are creating. So yes, I think this is more or less my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Felipe. Congratulations on your presentation. And we have 10 minutes for questions. So Iago can go ahead.
Hi, Felipe, thank you. I was thinking about how can you individuate these coherence criteria for really weird characters or works. Is this individuation done by character or by work? Like, is Judas Contract, for example, canon for just Nightwing, or it's canon for example, Nightwing and Coriander, for example? I don't know. Like, I think the problem that I see is with really, really weird characters, such as, I don't know, Mr. and Mrs. Pitlick. Mr. and Mrs. Pitlick has like canonical stories that are in the animated show and the comics and all of those things at the same time, which would not, I don't think you will consider like important for other characters that appear along with Mr. and Mrs. Pitlick and other stuff. So I think to repeat the question, is the coherence criteria divided by character or by work?
Yes, okay. That is a very interesting question, because maybe what you're also asking is about Mr. Pickles, no? So it's like non-coherent the way in which he interacts, no, with the main stories, no? Maybe in a way. So how can we discern in that case what is true or not when something that is incoherent comes to a story?
So I think the Mr. Spitzley is I don't know, his superpower is that he's in all the same Mr. Spitzley are in all the media. Like comics is Mr. Spitzley is the same as the animated show Mr. Spitzley. So if you take like, I don't know, the TV show Mr. Spitzley as canonical, will it make like, I don't know, canonical information about the I don't know, TV show Nightwing should be the same as Mr. Spitlick? I don't know. It's weird. I don't know if the identity criteria for identifying this important canonical pieces they are by character or they are by, I don't know, issue of the comic or issue or I don't know, episode of the animated series. I don't know.
Okay, so I think probably my answer would be towards the whole thing, not just one specific character, because the coherence should be not among the identity of one character, but the identity and the relation that that character has also with other characters and other settings. So maybe Yes, I think it will make more sense if you address like that individuation not per character but per story. I'm seeing that there is a problem when characters like this one, that for example they are intermediate and they are aware of that they are a comic character, for example. So that would make like a conflict between others. I need to think about it, but I think it will be the coherence criteria should be held through stories, not through individual characters. Yes. Yes.
That's
Thank
the
you.
different intuition that I had. I thought it would be better for character, not for story. But thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Enrique?
Yes. Well, thank you for the talk. I sympathize with the idea that truth is not a closed thing in fiction. It's open to change. My question is about a particular case. I don't know if you are familiar with H.P. Lovecraft and the myths of Cthulhu, but it's like a shared universe between many writers, being Lovecraft the central figure. But when Lovecraft dies, his editor, Auguste Derleth, like changed some of the central ideas on the canon to make them like more close to Christianism. Most of the later authors within the Lovecraft circle reject these ideas. As a result, it was like two canon they're created. One that accepted their left changes, and the other that follow the primitive ideas of Lovecraft. In that case, you consider that we have two canon for the same fictional universe, or you think that there is a problem in the negotiation and just there is a true canon, the other, whatever it is, it's like a false canon or something like that.
Yes, thank you. Yes. I think in that case, I'm happy with the idea that there can be different canons, because I also think that there are different type of readers and communities that will accept different kind of things. But even in that, there are some truths that should hold within those different canons. I think that very similar to religion, because most of the literature that we have about canon is also based on religion. No? So maybe in Christianity, there are different, ways to understand what is written on the Bible. And even though there are some things that hold true through different churches, even though they accept different things as canonicals, I think that is almost the same with comics and with massive serialized fiction. So in the case of Lovecraft, yes, I think that it's fine to have people that accept only the pure things that Lovecraft wrote as canonical, and then other people that accept that. But in that case, the thing is that, yes, I am happy with the idea of different canons. Yes, I think that is my answer. Yes, but thank you.
Okay, thank you.
No.
Thank you, Enrique. I have a question as well. My question, Felipe, I really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you very much. My question is, what does massive serialized fiction do for authorhood or authorship? I mean, does it needs to change? Do we need to change our conception of what an author is in light of these kinds of fiction? Because we have an intuition, for example, for Sherlock Holmes, that he or it, depending on our stance, metaphysical stance, was created by Conan Doyle. But perhaps in the case of those massive sorts of fiction, we should attribute a list of creators, much like a paper can have a list of lots of authors. What would you say about that?
Yes. I think that we need to readdress the idea of authorship, because especially with comics, sometimes there are some things in which you can address like one person that is like controlling the whole production of the comic. That happens, for example, with big names like Alan Moore, for example. So if you read a comic by him, he's behind the script, but also the inker, but also the painter, but also like many things at the same time. No, but that is not common in the way in which comics are produced, because you have, even sometimes they don't interact with each other. Different people, like in different parts of the world now, because we have all this online way of work. So in those scenarios, it's difficult to address just one main intention, or like, yes, like synchrony within different intentions to get one product, and yet we have one product. So yes, I think we need to rethink the way in which authorship is being defined. And there is something towards that yes, I need to work, I think, for the next chapter. But yes, that's a main question I have. Thank you. Yes.
That's great. Thank you. So we now move to our second presentation of this afternoon. Italo Lins Lemos is a professor at UFCA, Universidade Federal do Cariri, Ceará, and today he will present to us about truth-making in fiction.
That's perfect. So thank you very much, Jersey. Hello, everyone. My name is Italo Lins Lemos, as Jersey said. I am a professor at UFCA, and today I am going to talk about truth-making in fiction. And this is a subject matter that has been overlooked in the community because we only have one paper by Fred Kroon that was published in 2000. And it sort of says that there is no such a thing as truth-making in fiction. And there is a book that was published in 2020 by Jamin Essay that is more sympathetic to this possibility. And I would like to discuss if there is such a thing as truth-making in fiction from an artifactualist perspective. So my presentation is divided in 4 parts. In the first part, I'm going to talk about very briefly about my background assumptions on the metaphysics and ontology of fiction. And I can say up front that I am an artifactualist, which means that I say that yes, fictional objects, they do exist and they are abstract artifacts. Then in the second section, I am going to say a few words about what I am understanding by truth-making, just so that section 3, which may be the most important in this presentation, is the section in which I'm going to talk about more specifically about truth-making in fiction. But I'm going to give 3 different answers according to the kind of utterance that is involved. So there is one specific answer for fictional utterances, another for metafictional utterances, and another answer for parafictional utterances. And finally, in section 4, I am going to present my concluding remarks. So this is the plan for today's presentation. Right, so let's start from the beginning. And when we're talking about the metaphysics of fiction, I am using this classic book that was written by Amy Thomason and published in 1999, which is called Fiction and Metaphysics. And according to Thomason, in a really nice way, she says that fictional characters or fictional objects are abstract artifacts. And here by fictional object, I mean something really general, like fictional characters, such as Sherlock Holmes, Harry Potter, Rodion Raskolnikov. But I also mean fictional places, like Narnia, we could say, or even fictional items, like the sword Excalibur. All of these things count as a fictional object. And they are abstract artifacts. Well, I'm saying that these objects are, let me just, here we go. So fictional objects are artifacts because they are intentionally created by an author, meaning that we are assuming that authors of fiction are creative individuals. For example, I am saying that when Arthur Conan Doyle wrote A Study in Scarlet, he, because he's a creative person, created this character we call Sherlock Holmes, for example. And they are abstracts because, like my cell phone over here, or like my laptop that I'm using right now, these things are intentionally created by someone. But differently from concrete artifacts like the laptop or my cell phone or my t-shirt, fictional objects are abstract because they lack spatial temporal location and also they have no causal powers. And by this, I mean that if we could build a time machine and go back in time to London in the 19th century, we would not find Sherlock Holmes or anyone that was a friend of Watson, a detective, smoked the pipe, and so on, because Sherlock Holmes, again, is abstract, right? And even if we could go back in time and find someone that looked like Sherlock Holmes, that person would not be Sherlock Holmes. And again, the reason why we are not supposed to call Holmes in order to solve a mystery or a crime or anything like that is because fictional characters have no causal powers. So they can do those things unless we are talking about the things they do according to the story. So the main motivation, according to Thomason, is that we describe authors as inventing their characters, making them up, or creating them, so that before being written about by an author, there is no fictional object. So what I'm saying is that Sherlock Holmes exists in this specific sense, but on the other hand, I'm saying that Sherlock Holmes' daughter does not exist because there is no relevant story according to which Sherlock Holmes had a daughter, right? So we are not inflating our ontology because of this. Okay, so what I said about the metaphysics and ontology of fiction doesn't need to apply exactly to artifactualism because the approach I'm putting forward today, in a sense, also works if you assume that fictional objects are objects. So if you are a possibilist or even an Meinongian, the answer is going to be a little bit different, but similar to what I'm saying. But if you don't assume that fictional objects are objects, yes, what I'm going to say will not work at all, right? So this is the only requirement I would presuppose. Okay, so let's say a few words about truth making now. Well, when it comes to truth making and realism, I follow Jamin Essay and say that one central claim for the truth making theory is that truth depends on reality, but not vice versa, not the way around. Given an example, what makes or in virtue of what are the following propositions true? So I can say something like one, Socrates exists. This sentence expresses a true proposition, right? Of course, if you're assuming classic logic, I'm not tensing this sentence. Like we saw last Wednesday with Berto, we could say that Socrates don't exist anymore because he died, for example. But I'm not tensing this proposition. If I wanted to talk about someone who is alive, I would just change the example, right? So you get the gist of it. So I'm just assuming that, yes, number one, the sentence expresses a proposition, and that proposition is true. Sentence number two says, Socrates is human. Again, this sentence expresses a proposition, and it is also true. And I could say, number three, there are humans. This sentence also expresses a proposition, and this proposition is true. So the question I'm raising is, in virtue of what are these propositions true? And the answer is because of Socrates. And I know that if you are not from Brazil, you are thinking about the Greek philosopher, but I'm not talking about that Socrates. I'm talking about the Brazilian soccer player, right? So in virtue of what is Socrates exists true? If you are a truth maker theorist, you're going to say that this proposition is made true because of Socrates, the person made of flesh and blood. Again, I could say that Socrates is human. In virtue of what is this proposition true? In virtue of Socrates, or in virtue of the fact that Socrates is human, for example. And finally, I said that there are humans is also a true proposition. Again, in virtue of what? I could say that, one more time, in virtue of Socrates. But of course, when it comes to sentence number three, it just shows that the truth making relation is not a one-to-one relationship because, yes, we can have more than one truth makers for the same proposition. Because in the possible worlds in which Socrates does not exist, if there is a human, that human being is also going to be a truth maker for proposition number three. In the actual world, I am a truth maker for proposition number three. Everybody that is here is also a truth maker for proposition number three. So again, there is more than one truth maker for the same true proposition. Awesome. So it comes to realize that there are two important concepts here. The first concept is that of a truth maker. So truth makers are the objects in the world in virtue of which truth bearers are true. So I'm just assuming for this presentation that there are two things in our ontological catalog that work as a truth maker. The first thing are objects, and the second thing are facts. Of course, if according to your ontological categories, you want to assume mereological sums or states of affairs or what have you, that's going to be totally fine. But for this presentation, I'm just assuming that objects and facts work as truth makers. And on the other hand, we have truth bearers. And truth bearers are true because of the existence of their truth makers. And in this case, I am assuming that truth bearers are propositions. Again, truth makers, objects and facts, truth bearers, propositions. And truth bearers are made true by truth makers, but not the other way around. Okay, so let's carry on. Armstrong says that the idea of a truth maker for a particular truth is just some portion of reality in virtue of which that truth is true. So again, I just said what is at stake here, but there is a new important concept, which is the expression in virtue of. What does in virtue of mean here? Again, I follow Armstrong and say that P is true if and only if there exists a T such that T necessitates that P, and P is true in virtue of T. What I'm saying is that a proposition is true if and only if there exists an object or a fact such that that object or fact necessitates that proposition, and that proposition is true in virtue of that object or that fact. And again, I'm just making things a little bit more complicated because I just introduced another important concept, which is the concept of necessitation. So what is at stake here when we talk about necessitation? Well, now I'm not following Armstrong anymore. I'm following Jamie Assay. And Assay says that in the language of possible worlds, X necessitates Y if and only if every possible world in which X exists is a world in which Y is true. So what I'm saying is that in every world in which Socrates exists, that is a world in which the proposition Socrates exists is true. In the worlds in which Socrates does not exist, the proposition Socrates exists is either nonsensical or it could be made false, depending on what we understand by truth, falsity, and lack of truth values, right? But the gist is, in the worlds in which Socrates exists, that is a world in which the proposition Socrates exists is true. And it shows that the truth-making relation is very neat, actually, but it has some qualities like irreflexivity, which means that a truth bearer can make the truth bearer true, right? It needs a truth maker in order to be true. Again, there is a relation of asymmetry. A truth bearer is made true by a truth maker, but not the other way around. And I'm also accepting that there is transitivity. So we can think or talk about indirect truth making. In this case, if A makes B true and B makes C true, then A makes C true. That's what is at stake here. In sum, if you want to write it down as the main thesis that I'm putting forward when it comes to truth making, what I'm saying is that, formally put, an object phi is a truth maker for a sentence S only if it's necessary that if phi exists, S is true. So this is what I am understanding by truth making. Right, so now let's apply both artifactualism and this notion of truth making to the case of fiction. But before, we need to make a distinction when it comes to the semantics of fiction. And this distinction was made by François Recanati in a paper he published in 2018. And there is a difference between fictional, metafictional, and parafictional utterances. And of course, it is important to say that the first formulation of this conceptual scheme was made by Andrea Bonomi and Alberto Voltolini, but they call it textual, metatextual, and paratextual utterances. And I don't think there is a relevant difference when it comes to the extension of these concepts. But let's talk about these three different kinds of utterances. Right. So fictional utterances are performed by one or more authors in a given work of fiction. So, for example, if you open the book Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, you're going to find the following situation that I'm numbering as 4. I am Rodion Romanovich Raskolnikov, formerly a student. I live in Shale's house, not far from here, flat number 14. So if you open a work of fiction, as in literature, in my example, like Crime and Punishment, you're going to find this sentence. If you open the Metamorphosis by Kafka, you're going to find different sentences and so on. But if that sentence is expressed in the work of fiction, it counts as a fictional utterance. And of course, we could raise the question, what is the illocutionary force of a fictional utterance? And there are many attempts to answer this question. The most famous are the pretense view that was put forward by John Searle in 1973, if I'm not mistaken, in a paper called The Logical Status of Fictional Discourse. And according to Searle, for example, there is no illocutionary force when an author performs a fictional utterance. What he or she is doing is just pretending to assert. A second option would be the directive view, which assumes that the author is inviting us to entertain a fictional proposition P, or he's prescribing us to imagine that P according to the story. And this perspective is defended by, for example, Manuel Garcia Carpintero. But I'm not going to talk about neither the pretense view nor the directive view because I feel like endorsing the declaration view today, right? And this is important for what I'm going to say about parafictional utterances. Okay, so what is the declaration view? This position was defended by Katharina Bell in her 2020 book called Fiction, by myself in a paper published in 2021, by Eleonora Orlando also in a paper I just discovered that was published too in 2021, and by Bergman and Franzen in 2022. And according to this view, and of course, I'm not exactly saying what Abel, Bergman, and Franzen are assuming. This is a position I would hold. But according to the declaration view, the author institutes a fictional fact in a fictional story. And by fictional fact, I only mean that something happens in that story. For example, Gregor Samsa was transformed into a monstrous insect. This is a fictional fact. It is not a fictional fact that Gregor Samsa was transformed into an elephant, for example. Right? This is what I mean by a fictional fact. And in order to illustrate this position, I quote Searle, even though Searle is not endorsing this position. But he says something like, because saying certain things counts as because saying certain things counts as entering into a contract or adjourning a meeting, you can perform those acts by saying you are performing them. So if I say something like, if I'm the chair of a meeting and say the meeting is adjourned, saying so makes it so, which means that this is very similar to what Austin understood as a performative in a general sense. Okay, but we are talking about truth-making, right? And when it comes to truth-making and fictional utterances, whatever view you adopt, either pretense, directive, or declaration, it is a consensus in the community that fictional utterances have no truth values. So proposition number 4 about Raskolnikov is neither true nor false, right? So if they lack truth values, there is no need for us to talk about truth makers here. So you could ask, so why am I talking about truth making in fictional utterances? Because the declaration view is going to be very important in a few minutes. Okay, so let's talk about metafictional utterances now. Metafictional utterances are performed in a non-fictional context and take a fictional object as a fictional object. So, for example, we could say Raskolnikov is a fictional character created by Fyodor Dostoevsky. I'm not saying that this is the case according to the story. I'm not saying that it was written by Dostoevsky in Crime and Punishment. I'm taking the fictional object as a fictional object. And in this case, we can see that metafictional utterances can be valued as either true or false. And in this case, this sentence number 5 expresses a true proposition because Raskolnikov really is a fictional character, and it really was created by Dostoevsky. For example, if I said that Raskolnikov was created by Kafka, I would have said something false. So if this is the case, here we have every illocutionary force, including assertions, at work. Therefore, metafictional utterances can be valued as either true or false, and they do have truth makers. According to Essay, following Amy Thomason here, there are at least 4 candidates for truth makers. A, the fictional object itself. B, the author's act of writing. C, a media where the story is told. And D, an audience that decodes the story. Which means that there are only 2 different categories that can work as truth makers for metafictional utterances. Either the fictional object itself, or the things on which it depends in order to come into existence and remain existing. Right? So these are the truth makers for metafictional utterances that express true propositions. So for example, if I say 5.1, Raskolnikov exists, in virtue of what is this proposition true according to Judge Factualist? The answer is in virtue of Raskolnikov itself, not according to Raskolnikov himself, because I'm not taking it according to the story. I'm taking it as an abstract artifact. Sentence 5.2, Raskolnikov was created by Dostoevsky. Again, in virtue of what is this proposition true according to Judge Factualist? The answer is in virtue of Dostoevsky's act of writing, which means that, again, if the truth-making relation is a relation of necessitation, in the possible worlds in which Dostoevsky didn't write Crime and Punishment or did anything but write novels, that is a possible world in which Raskolnikov was not created, and that is a possible world in which sentence 5.2 expresses a false proposition. But it's important to remark that if I said something like 6, there are murderers, and we know that according to the story, Raskolnikov is a murderer, could Raskolnikov be a truth maker for 6? The answer is no, because Raskolnikov is not a murderer, at least not metafictionally a murderer. It is a fictional murderer. I'm sorry, it is a fictional murderer, right? And I have written a paper about the subject matter that was published last year about modifying adjectives and more specifically, the different uses for the adjective fictional in these contexts. All right, I know I'm running out of time, but I'm going to say just a few words about truth-making in parafictional utterances. Right, so what are parafictional utterances? They are performed in a non-fictional context and are preceded by a prefix or sentence operator equivalent to according to the story. So for example, number 7, we have according to Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov is a murderer. This is actually the case according to the story, which means that parafictional utterances can be valued as either true or false. In this context, number 7, the sentence number 7 expresses a true proposition. It is actually the case that according to the story, Raskolnikov is a murderer. Notice if I said something like, according to Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov was transformed into a monstrous insect, that would have been a false proposition, because that happened to Gregor Samsa in the Metamorphoses. All right, so here we have, again, every illocutionary force, including assertions, at work. Therefore, parafictional utterances can be valued as either true or false, and they do have truth makers. And the reason why I was talking about the declaration view is that true parafictional utterances are made true in virtue of the fictional facts instituted by the relevant fictional utterance. So the reason why sentence number 7 expresses a true proposition is because there is a fictional fact established by a fictional utterance, either explicitly or implicitly, that makes it the case that according to the story, Raskolnikov is a murderer, right? Because there is a declaration, because the author of fiction is establishing, is instituting something in that story, which is an abstract artifact. So to sum it up, to round it up, well, I'm saying that when it comes to truth-making fiction, more specifically about fictional utterances, there are no truth makers, either if you hold the pretense, directive, or declaration view. When it comes to metafictional utterances, the truth makers are the fictional objects themselves or the things on which they depend in order to come into existence or to remain existing. And when it comes to parafictional utterances, the truth makers are the fictional facts instituted by the fictional utterances. So this is a very straightforward and simple account, I would say. Sometimes it is even quite obvious, but I think that artifactualism has a nice approach to the problem of truth making. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Italo. We have 7 minutes for questions. Henrique?
Thank you, Italo, for the talk. It was very insightful. I have a question related to the declaration view you adopted. You accepted Berman and Franzen declaration view, and I find a problem with that view. And it's the case like unreliable narrators, where you have fictional statement, fictional utterance that must work as truth makers, but in fact they make things true in fiction that they are actually not true in the fictional world. So how that fits in your theory, how they work? You need to understand like the entire fiction as the fiction maker, and instead of fictive fictional utterances one by one, or can you say something about that?
Excellent question. And I have that doubt also. And I would say that we need to have an implicit fictional utterances that suggest that, for example, the narrator is unreliable. And I'm going to give an example that was given by Merrill and Imar in the chapter they published in the collection The Language of Fiction. And they talk about the work Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. And there's a scene in which Huckleberry Finn is at a dinner table, and he sees someone that is mumbling some words before eating, before having the meal. And according to Huckleberry Finn, the character, that person is cursing, or that person is unsatisfied because of something that we can't really understand. And because in this case, the character is unreliable, we are supposed to imagine that the person who is having dinner with Huckleberry Finn is not actually cursing, but he or she is probably praying before dinner. So how are we supposed to say that, for example, Huckleberry Finn is an unreliable narrator if he, or in this case, it is the narrator? Well, we need to interpret the work, and we need to find out what sounds off in order for us to assume that that is the case. But again, we need to have some sort of implicit fictional utterance in order to establish that that's the case. Or worst case scenario, we need to assume that what is said is false, and if that is false, then the opposition is true. But we need to have something in the story, just so we can say that according to the story, something happens. Does that satisfy your question?
Yes, thank you.
And if it doesn't, we can talk about that later.
Thank you. Meryl?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so it's I agree. I think with most of what you say. So it seems as the right story about the truth making. Just one tiny thing that you said struck me at some point, because you used the pronoun it to refer to the abstract object, the fictional character. So yeah, so I've worked a bit with anaphora and referring to fictional characters, etc. And I struggled with this at some point. It seemed to me if it is an abstract object, yeah, we should use it, but actually nobody really does, right? So it's much more natural to say something like, yeah, Sherlock Holmes is a great character. He was invented by Arthur Conan Doyle. So it's clear that we are referring to it in a metafictional context, but we never use it. Sherlock Holmes is a great character. It was invented by Arthur Conan Doyle, right? So why is that? Why do you think that is actually the appropriate pronoun, but we never use it? Do you have an explanation for that? It would be great if you have one.
I don't know if I have one actually, but your point is very nice because indeed, if I say from the philosophical point of view, the correct way to say or to talk about Holmes metafictionally is using the pronoun it, I'm going to be revisionist, right? I'm going to revise the way we talk about Fisher because I totally agree with you. The reason why I put the it in italics was to call attention to that fact because if I didn't, maybe that wouldn't be like, we wouldn't pay attention to what was happening there. Right. So, yes, I agree with you. We use he, she, or another pronoun in order to talk about characters in general, even when it comes to metafictional utterances. But the problem is, if we assume that artifactualism is correct, like I do, I need to say that it is an abstract artifact. So outside of the scope of the story, I can even say that Raskolnikov, for example, is a human being. I can say that Raskolnikov lives or lived in St. Petersburg or that he committed a crime because, again, it's an abstract artifact. If it is abstract, so it is not in space and time, it can't causally interact with other objects in the world. So if there is no causal relations related to Raskolnikov, how could it kill someone? It just can't. But I feel your worry because, yes, that's not the way we talk about fiction when it comes to metafictional utterances. But yeah, we need to use the pronoun it if we want to be philosophically or artifactually correct in this case. Yeah.
Yeah, but so it's not really what people do. So I mean, that's a problem for me as well, right? I have also defended this idea that in metafictional context you're referring to abstract objects, but yeah, from the use of pronouns, that doesn't seem to be consistent with what people actually do and what is intuitive language use. So yeah, it's a problem for you and me.
Yeah, and just to sum him up, I would say that even though we're using he or she, that pronoun, even in cases of anaphora, refer to that fictional object. I would hold that position. There is just one name in this case, which is Raskolnikov in this example, and that's it. But thank you very much, Meryl.
Okay, thank you very much, Italo. And we now move on to the presentation by Elisa. So Elisa Paganini is a professor at the Università di Milano, and she will present fiction as non-assertive communication.
Right. First of all, thank you to organizers of this conference for the nice occasion for the talk I've heard so far and the discussion I heard so far. So let me say that I decided to defend a claim. So the idea of my presentation is to defend a claim. First of all, I will try to explain to you what the claim is and why I think it is worth claiming it. And then I will consider in the second part the two objections, and I will try to reply to the objection to this claim. So my proposal is to consider fiction as a communicative act in which conformity to the truth is suspended. That's the idea I want to defend. There are two components in fiction, so according to this proposal. Fiction are a communicative act which allows for a communication of a content, but they are also made within a suspension of the obligation to conform to the truth. This is, according to me, this characteristic of fictional communicative act and distinguish them, for example, from assertion. So first of all, let me try to explain to you what I mean by suspension of an application. I start with a very simple and naive example. Consider the example of dress code. There may be a situation in which we are invited to places or events which have a dress code, and compare these cases with cases in which there is no dress code at all. While in the first case, we are expected, we are in a certain sense obliged or committed to dress in a particular way, in the last case, everyone can go as he or she likes. So she can be casual or elegant as she likes. The situation is quite similar to the following, because the comparison we can have between the case in which there is commitment to truth or commitment to untruth and no commitment to truth at all. What I want to argue is that fiction is characterized by no commitment to truth at all. But let me say that even if it is not universally admitted or claimed, but there is a certain agreement that in the case of fiction, there is a commitment to at least partial untruth or at least to accidental truth. So let's try to consider why it is a common assumption that fiction is characterized by commitment to partial untruths or at least to accidental truths. The example usually consider are examples like the following. So, consider an historical fiction, for example. In this case, usually the historical events are true, but the fictional characters are invented and what happens to them are usually invented. So the work of fiction is constituted by certain events or certain facts which are true and others which are not true. So the idea is that in the case of fiction, there is a commitment at least to partial untruth. But there are cases, and this is what is usually found in the literature, in which the fiction may be completely true. And the situations which are usually taken into consideration are situations in which a real person, the fiction is about a real person, suppose, for example, the King of England, and the characters in the fiction are actually living people, but the fictional author invents some events happen to them. But as a matter of fact, suppose that unknown to the author, the events are true. And so in those cases, the idea is that the fiction is it is accidentally truth, which means not intentionally truth. The fictional author didn't intend it to be true, but actually it happened to be true. Why I think that this characterization is not adequate? I think that there are fiction, or there may be fiction, let's say, that can be intentionally true from start to end. It is very difficult to find an example of a case like that because obviously it is difficult that a fictional author says, I wrote only true fact. But there are examples which can be helpful in a sense to think about it. And the example I give you, an example I take from David Davis, is Seamus Dean's Reading in the Dark. This is a work which were originally commissioned as an autobiographical work. And as a matter of fact, the narrated event closely followed Dean's own childhood. But when the author finished the work, he asked to have it published as a work of fiction, something which the editor accepted. And this book was actually the winner of the Guardian Fiction Prize in 1998. Now, it can be that Deans realized while written the text, the work, that in order to make the work more interesting, more engaging, he had to make up some events. So the reason why he published it as fiction is that there are some untruths in it. But there can be other cases. Suppose that Dean actually wrote a book which is true from the beginning to the end. But the reason why he decided to publish it as fiction are quite different. Suppose that, for example, he wanted to, he thought that some relatives could be offended and they can defend themselves, saying that it is fiction. Or suppose that he didn't want people to be too much interested about his particular life, but he want the book to be considered in a different way, in a more fictional way. There is nothing which is, so if that is the case, suppose that Dean wrote this book, putting in it only truth assertion from the beginning to the end. There is nothing wrong he made in publishing it as fiction. And in my opinion, there is nothing wrong, because fiction simply requires not to be committed to truth, but one can say truths or false things. The point is that this is not the relevant aspect. That's what I want to claim. So my proposal, as I try to say, this is my claim in a more rigorous way, is that a work or statement is fiction if and only if it is a communicative act within a shared practice in which any commitment to truth is suspended. Now, I want to consider two possible objections which can be raised to my claim. So the two possible objections is that the first one is that the suspension of the commitment to truth is not sufficient for fiction. There are cases in which such suspension is adopted outside fiction. Or it can be claimed that the suspension of the commitment to truth is not necessary for fiction. Namely, there are assertions committed to truth within fiction. So let's consider the two objections separately, and I will explain to you how I'm going to reply to them. First objection, the suspension of the commitment to truth is not sufficient for fiction. Examples are things like the following. Suppose that I tell you my dream. I'm not committed to the truth of what I dreamed, obviously. So there is no commitment to truth. Well, you know, there is a certain commitment to truth in this case. There is the commitment to the truth that I really dreamed it. Or suppose that I tell you an hypothesis concerning a certain event, or a hypothesis as what causes a certain event we are considering. In this case, I'm not committed to the truth of what I'm hypothesizing, but I committed to the truth of what follows from the hypothesis, that the hypothesis is adequate. Or suppose that a philosopher presents a thought experiment, like, for example, Jackson presenting the example of Mary living in the white and black room. Obviously, there is no commitment to the truth of the thought experiment. But at least when Jackson published the article, the famous article, he was committed to the truth of the response to the thought experiment. So in general, my reaction to this kind of example is that I accept that there are cases in which, in a certain sense, the commitment to truth is also suspended outside fiction. But what I claim is that this suspension outside fiction is limited to some aspect of the speech, is not global. But the objector can be more aggressive and say, but there are cases in which there is global suspension of the commitment to truth outside fiction. Consider the following case, the case in which the speaker says P, but I do not want to be held responsible for saying P, and I will deny that I ever said P. Well, obviously, in this case, the speaker denies any commitment to the truth of P. But the point I want to claim is that in this case, he's explicit about denying commitment to truth. And the reason why he's explicit is exactly that he's performing, or she is performing, in the context of a shared practice in which the commitment to the truth is in charge. If he were not denying commitment to truth, and he was not so committed outside fiction, it would be either a liar or a deceiver. So I think that the suspension of the commitment to truth is sufficient, a sufficient condition, normative condition for fiction. Let's consider the other objection. The suspension of the commitment to truth is not necessary for fiction. There are assertions within fiction. Legal assertions are a statement like the beginning of Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, but we can also think of cases in which the author of fiction addressed directly the reader, or the actor on the stage addressed directly the audience. So these are cases which may be interpreted as assertions. But the important point is that those cases are not clearly interpreted. So philosophers disagree about the way in which those statements should be interpreted. So let's consider the three possible interpretation, or the interpretation which I found in the literature. And let me explain why I think that my claim can be maintained, whichever of the three interpretations of this alleged assertion are taken. The first interpretation is that the authors express their own view of the real world. So in the case of Tolstoy's statement at the beginning of the book, he's really asserting something. Well, if that is the case, if there are really assertions within fiction, those assertions are not considered to be, should not be considered to be fictional assertions. So as Cariri says, the work of fiction is a patchwork of fiction and non-fiction. And the alleged assertions are non-fiction, and therefore there is commitment to truth for them. And my claim is about fiction, not about non-fiction. There are other philosophers instead who think that those alleged assertions provide information about the fictional world they are describing. So when Tolstoy writes the statement, is giving some information about an unhappy family within the fiction. If that is the case, then it's not claiming there is no commitment to truth in this, or non-fictional truth in those statements. And therefore, they are within this suspension of the commitment to truth. And there is also a third interpretation of this alleged statement, is that the authors are ambiguous, leaving it open whether they are talking about the real world, the fictional world, or both. Well, in this case, the idea is that a single statement has, or it can have two contents, a fictional one and non-fictional one. And again, my claim will be that the non-fictional one is committed to truth somehow, but the fictional one, the fictional content, is still within this practice of no suspension of the commitment to truth. So I would say that such suspension of commitment to truth is also necessary for fiction. Thank you very much for your attention. And just give you some.
Thank you very much, Elisa. It's great. So we have plenty of time for questions. We have 14 minutes. I'd like to start. So I can start?
Yeah.
Okay. Would you say, do we need necessary and sufficient conditions do we need our definition of fiction to be necessary and sufficient, or can we stick to a less strict definition and sort of cut the line in a more vague way or in a loose way and be happy with it? What would you say about vagueness concerning fiction?
That's a good point. So if you give a necessary and sufficient condition, this doesn't mean that fiction is not vague, because this necessary and sufficient condition can be vaguely instantiated, and therefore it can be vague whether a statement is fiction or non-fiction. What I thought reading the literature is that there is a certain form of skepticism on the possibility to define fiction. And I thought that this kind of way to interpret fiction just allowed to overcome this skepticism. This doesn't mean that I want fiction to be to have sharp boundaries, but I think that the skepticism about the definition of fiction can be can be overcome somehow. That's what I'm trying to say.
Okay, interesting. Good. So Enrique?
Thank you for the talk, Lisa. It was great. I have a clarification question. Depending on the answer, a follow-up. The clarification question is, it's the intention of the author what determines the compromise with the truth, or with the association of the preference with truth or false? I mean, if I intend to write a book, and that book is not related to truth or false, that it's enough to be fiction? So it's the intention, the crucial point?
No. What I'm trying to say is that the intention is not the crucial point. What I'm trying to say is that there is a social convention which characterizes fiction, which is this suspension of the commitment to truth. Within this conventional or social convention, the author may intend what she or he wants, and this doesn't really matter. That this is what is relevant is that people are aware of this convention, and I think that this is relevant when we consider a work as fiction or non-fiction. So we can accuse a certain author of not saying, for example, the truth if he's writing a non-fiction. But we cannot do that with fiction. And the reason is not that the fictional author cannot say something true, but the reason is that he's writing within a convention which avoid any commitment to truth. That's what the way I would put it. So I'm not an intentionalist. The intention is not relevant for, or at least it's not relevant for the definition of fiction. I'm not saying that it's not relevant at all, but I'm saying that it's not relevant for the definition of fiction.
Okay, thank you. I was thinking the opposite case. An example, it's in Catherine's Abel book, and it's The Spare Room, Helen Gardner novel, in which she describes how some clinics try to exploit a friend of hers. She was dying for cancer. The idea is that if the author used the real name of the clinic, despite being published as fiction, she couldn't be performing a fiction-making act, I think, because there is a connection with the real world, and there is necessity a link with truth, because she was defaming something because she was using the real name. In this case, the author wouldn't be following the convention, or how do you explain that case? For example, if I publish a novel with the clear intention of defaming someone.
So I think that this is a case in which if you write a novel where the facts are true, and you even want that the readers, this is a case, this is an example, that example is another example, very important example, an example I have in mind when I wrote, I started to think about this idea. And my opinion is that this is a case of a fiction, and this is something which the author can adopt such a convention, and it remains a fiction. And as a matter of fact, possibly this is a case in which the author decided to publish the work as fiction exactly because she didn't want to go into a trial or into any legal commitment. And, you know, this is something which, historically speaking, has happened very often. So more or less explicitly, sometimes authors decide to just give a different name to a real person they actually met, and they just go to represent real facts with different names. So there are cases in which fiction doesn't really, there are many cases in which fiction is not just made up from the beginning to the end, but just reproduce something which the author has really experienced in life. And the reason why one wants to work within this convention can be very different. On the one side, the more simple one can be, I don't want to be committed to give any evidence of what I've written. That's an easy way, the more easy way. But there are maybe other more deep reasons to do that. For example, if the reader is not concerned with truth, with the truth of what I'm saying, she may be concerned with other aspects, the aspect we have been considering during the conference in many occasions. So emotional aspects, engagement without commitment. So this is a convention which has shown to be very powerful in many ways. And what I'm trying to do is try to consider that we are working within not within a normative convention, but in a situation in which certain norms are suspended, and try to see what happens. That's the general idea I'm trying to work on.
Thank you. Simon?
Yeah, thank you very much. That was interesting. So you talked at one point about a social convention with respect to commitment to truth. And at another time, you talked about appearing as part of a practice that was governed by that convention. So if somebody publishes something, there have to be certain facts that will make it true that we're to assess it in the light of a given convention, that it's subject or not subject to a convention. And I'm imagining that those will form the practice. So, for example, being published with the word fiction on the cover, or being published by a certain publisher. And if that's the case, wouldn't it be sufficient to characterize fiction just as something that's produced as part of that practice? And then one could leave the whole business about commitment to truth out of the picture altogether. Even if it was true of that practice, that as a matter of fact, people were not committed to commitment to truth. What would make the work fiction is just that it's basically published with the word fiction on the title.
Right. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to think that this actually is something which, even if not explicit, probably not so explicit, because I haven't found it in the literature, works implicitly in the way in which we interpret fiction. That's the idea. So I'm trying to make explicit an assumption we take somehow for granted. And the more and more I think about it, it is a work in progress, obviously, but the more and more I think about it, the more I realize that it can be powerful. What I mean is that even fiction is not something which is which has a stable convention, but conventions are changing, are transforming themselves. And the reason why it is so powerful, and it can be more conventional, less can use certain convention already taken for granted, but it can also try to use new ways of expressing itself. My impression is that the idea that this communication happens with a suspension of certain assumption taken for granted, which is a certain commitment taken for granted, leaves open the possibility from both the author and also the reader or the audience to introduce different instruments to interpret the fiction. That's the general idea I'm trying to work on.
Thank
so
you.
The idea is this one. Thank you. Thank you very much for this question.
Okay, thank you very much. We are out of time. So thank you once again, Elisa, and everybody that presented in this session, Felipe, Italo. And thank you. We will take a short break, 30-minute break, and we will return, I mean, less than 30 minutes, it's 27-minute break. And we will return at 4 p.m. here in Brazil, and adjust for your local times, with the conference by Eleonora Orlando, Fiction as